The Omega heard wolves no one else could. The Alpha King needed the gift to survive. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to our main character, Elena Hart, an Omega who learned early that silence could be louder than shouting. Because in the northern territories where the forest stretched for miles and the nights carried the cool bite of mountain air, Elena heard things no one else noticed, not with her ears exactly, but somewhere deeper, as if the world whispered only to her. On most evenings, she would stand at the edge of the old path behind the settlement, measuring the distance to the tree, lined by instinct rather than steps, feeling the air thicken when the moon rose. And that was when the sounds came, not howls meant for distance or dominance, but broken, uneven rhythms that felt like breathing out of sync, sounds that pressed against her chest until she had to close her eyes and steady herself. And when she tried to explain this to others, they smiled politely or frowned with concern, calling it imagination, calling it nerves, reminding her that Omegas were sensitive and that sensitivity often invented problems where none existed. Elena learned to nod, to step back, to keep her gift folded neatly inside her like a letter never mailed. Yet the nights grew louder, the forest heavier, and the air carried a tension even the strongest wolves pretended not to feel, while far beyond the settlement walls, in a stone hall measured in feet thick enough to keep out winter storms, Alpha King Rowan Blackthorn sat awake long after midnight, his candle burning low as the hours dragged on, because sleep no longer came easily to him, and the silence inside his own chest felt wrong, like a room with the furniture removed. No healer could name the cause, no counselor dared guess aloud, and the king, known for his steady presence and calm authority, felt something slipping out of alignment, a strain that echoed faintly through the land itself, though he would never admit it. Elena sensed that strain as clearly as she sensed the chill of the wind before a storm, and one night, as the moon climbed higher and the temperature dipped into the low 40s, the sound sharpened, drawing a straight line through her thoughts, pointing unmistakably toward the distant palace. And for the first time she understood that what she heard was not the forest crying out, but a single soul calling for balance, a call that had nothing to do with rank or power and everything to do with survival. And as Elena turned back toward the lights of the settlement, heart steady but determined, she did not yet know that the path ahead would pull her into the center of a fate larger than any one wolf. Only that ignoring the sound was no longer possible, because when the world asks to be heard, someone has to listen. Elena Hart tried to return to her routines the morning after the sound sharpened, but the world refused to fit back into its old shape, because once you realize a pattern exists, pretending it does not feels like holding your breath and hoping the air forgets you need it. She carried water from the well measured in gallons instead of buckets, folded linen in the communal hall, and kept her head down as others spoke around her about weather shifts and restless nights. Yet beneath every ordinary sound there was that same uneven rhythm tugging at her awareness, steady as a second heartbeat. And when she paused long enough to listen, it always leaned north, always toward the palace walls miles away, a distance she could picture clearly even though she had never been allowed inside. People noticed her distraction, of course. Omegas were noticed when they strayed from expectation, and a few whispered that she was letting her sensitivity get the better of her again, that the changing season made everyone uneasy, that nothing more needed to be said. And Elena answered with quiet agreement, because arguing never changed minds, but silence gave her space to think. What troubled her most was not the sound itself, but the way it reacted to her thoughts, how it softened when she focused and tightened when she pulled away, as if it were aware of being heard, as if listening mattered. And that idea followed her through the afternoon until the shadows stretched long across the ground, and the temperature dipped into the high 30s, bringing with it the familiar hush before nightfall. Far away, King Rowan Blackthorn convened his council in a chamber built to withstand storms and siege alike, its length measured in yards and its ceiling lost in shadow. And though his posture remained composed, those closest to him noticed the way his attention slipped, how his gaze lingered on nothing at all, how his breathing sometimes fell out of rhythm, moments he covered with practiced calm, because a king could not afford to admit that something inside him felt misaligned. The council spoke of supply routes and patrol schedules, but Rowan heard only fragments, an echo beneath their voices that reminded him of standing alone in a vast space and calling out, waiting too long for the sound to return. And when the meeting ended, he dismissed them earlier than usual, choosing solitude over questions he did not want to answer. As night settled fully, Elena stood once more at the edge of the settlement, wrapping her coat tighter against the cold, and let herself listen without restraint, counting the seconds between each pulse, noticing how the air seemed to press inward, and for the first time she whispered back, not words meant for anyone else, just a steady breath shaped into reassurance. And the sound shifted, subtle but unmistakable, easing by a fraction that made her chest loosen. She did it again, grounding herself the way she always had when others felt overwhelming. And the response came quicker this time, a faint sense of alignment, like two clocks finally ticking together. And Elena understood then that what she carried was not a burden meant to be endured alone, but a connection waiting to be acknowledged, one that could not be explained away as nerves or imagination. Because somewhere beyond the trees a man she had never met sat, straighter, his breath evening out without knowing why, and the land itself seemed to settle into a quieter watchfulness, as if both were waiting for the same next step. By the third night the pattern could no longer be dismissed as coincidence, because Elena Hart noticed that the sound responded to time as much as attention, growing sharper at nearly the same hour when the moon cleared the treetops and the temperature slid into the mid-30s. And she began marking it quietly in her mind the way others track tides or seasons, not with numbers written down, but with sensations layered one over another. She tested it carefully, stepping closer to the forest edge, then back toward the settlement lights, noting how the rhythm tightened when distance increased and loosened when she faced north. And though no one else perceived a difference, Elena felt as certain as if she were watching a compass needle swing, and certainty, once formed, was hard to ignore. Meanwhile in the palace, King Rowan Blackthorn found himself pacing halls measured in long strides rather than resting, his steps echoing softly against stone that had stood for generations, and for the first time since taking the throne he allowed the healers to linger longer than courtesy required, though they brought familiar reassurances about stress and responsibility, suggestions about rest and diet, all reasonable, all insufficient, because what unsettled him was not pain but dissonance, a sense that his inner balance was slipping just enough to be felt, like a note played slightly off-key. When they left, Rowan stood at the tall window overlooking the land, calculating distances without conscious effort, miles of forest and field stretching beyond sight, and he wondered when the nights had begun to feel heavier, when the silence had stopped being empty and started feeling expectant. Elena felt that expectancy too as she walked home under a sky clear enough to show every star, her breath visible in short clouds, her steps steady on the packed earth, and she remembered how elders once said some omegas were meant to listen rather than lead, words usually spoken as limitation, yet listening, she realized now, was not passive, it required attention, patience, and the willingness to hold space for something unfinished. The next evening she experimented again, this time grounding herself fully, feet planted, shoulders relaxed, breathing slow, and she did not whisper reassurance, but simply aligned her thoughts with the rhythm she sensed, letting it pass through her awareness without resistance. And the response came clearer than before, not louder, but steadier, a subtle easing that made her chest warm despite the cold air. At nearly the same moment, Rowan paused mid-step in a corridor lined with banners, surprised to find his breathing matching a calmer pace he had not consciously chosen, the familiar tightness receding just enough to be noticeable, and he rested one hand against the wall, steadying himself, aware that something had shifted without explanation. Word began to spread quietly through the settlement that the king seemed less withdrawn, that his public appearances felt more grounded, and others attributed it to routine or resilience, while Elena said nothing at all, choosing instead to observe, because patterns revealed themselves best when left undisturbed. She sensed now that whatever bound the rhythm to the palace was growing more precise, narrowing like a line drawn from her awareness straight through miles of land to a single point. And with that clarity came an understanding that frightened and steadied her at once. Because if listening alone could ease the strain, then proximity might matter even more. And the thought of approaching a place she had always been kept far from tightened her throat. Yet the nights continued. The sound continued. And each time she listened, the response confirmed what she already knew, that ignoring this connection would not make it fade, and that somewhere beyond walls and titles a life depended on alignment rather than force, on being heard rather than commanded, a truth Elena carried with quiet resolve as the land itself seemed to hold its breath. The realization settled into Elena's heart slowly, the way dawn light creeps across the ground before anyone thinks to call it morning, because the rhythm she followed no longer felt distant or abstract. It felt anchored, fixed to a place she could name even if she had never crossed its threshold, and that knowledge changed how she moved through the day, how she measured her steps and her silences. She stopped walking to the forest edge and instead turned inward, closing her eyes wherever she stood, letting the sound guide her sense of direction, and every time it led her the same way, straight and unwavering, pointing beyond the hills toward the palace, not as a symbol of power but as a source. And once she accepted that, the connection sharpened with startling clarity. Across the land, King Rowan Blackthorn experienced a corresponding shift, subtle but undeniable, because the moments of imbalance that once arrived without warning now seemed to hesitate, as if waiting for permission, and when he focused on his breathing, grounding himself the way he had learned long ago in training yards measured in feet and discipline, the relief came faster, smoother, leaving him with the unsettling impression that something unseen was meeting him halfway. Elena tested the limits of that meeting carefully, listening at different hours, during the quiet stretch before dawn and again at dusk, and each time the rhythm aligned most strongly when she imagined herself closer to its source, not in longing but in intent. And with that came an understanding that startled her into stillness, because the sound was not merely reacting to her presence. It was responding to her nearness in thought, as if distance mattered less than attention. Word reached her that travelers from the palace had passed through nearby lands speaking in cautious tones about the king's condition, about councils held longer than usual and healers called more often than protocol required. And though no one spoke openly, the unease carried in those stories matched what Elena felt. Each night, reinforcing the truth she could no longer ignore. When she finally voiced her concern to an elder known for practicality rather than imagination, the response was measured and firm, reminding her that omegas were not summoned to royal matters without cause, that sensitivity did not equal authority, and that drawing lines between personal impressions and the affairs of a king was not her place. Words delivered without cruelty but heavy with finality, and Elena accepted them outwardly, while feeling the connection pulse beneath her calm exterior. Meanwhile, Rowan stood once more at his window, the land spread out before him in familiar distances he could name instinctively, and for the first time he wondered whether the answer to his unease lay not in discipline or endurance, but in something quieter, something that required listening rather than command, and the thought unsettled him enough that he dismissed it, only for it to return later, unbidden, as his breathing evened, again without effort. Elena understood then that waiting would change nothing, that the connection was asking for acknowledgement, not permission, and though the idea of stepping toward the palace filled her with apprehension born of years spent staying unnoticed, the certainty beneath it steadied her resolve, because this was not about ambition or recognition, it was about alignment, about responding when something essential was out of balance. As night fell once more and the rhythm grew clear and insistent, Elena stood quietly in her small room, feeling the weight of miles and walls between herself and the source, and for the first time she did not try to soften the sound, instead letting it resonate fully within her, accepting that the path ahead would require crossing boundaries she had been taught to respect, and somewhere beyond those boundaries, in a hall of stone and shadow, King Rowan Blackthorn paused, feeling the same resonance, the same sense that whatever had been missing was drawing closer, not through force or decree, but through recognition. The decision Elena Hart made did not announce itself with drama or haste. because she understood that crossing into spaces not meant for her required calm more than courage. And so she waited until the next market day, when the outer roads carried enough traffic that one quiet omega would not draw attention, measuring the miles by steady pace and borrowed transport, keeping her thoughts focused so the rhythm did not fade. The closer she drew to the palace lands, the clearer the connection became. Not louder, but more precise, like a signal narrowing into focus. And with every mile the certainty in her chest outweighed the unease, because she could feel how the balance shifted when she moved forward and tightened when she paused. The palace gates rose ahead of her, stone measured in feet thick and guarded by formality rather than hostility. And when Elena stepped forward and spoke calmly of a matter concerning the king's well-being, the guards exchanged looks that held skepticism rather than alarm, their responses polite but dismissive, reminding her that petitions followed process and that omegas did not arrive without summons. Words delivered with practiced courtesy that still carried the weight of boundary. Elena did not argue. She explained only that listening mattered, that something was out of alignment, and the guards listened long enough to decide she was mistaken, guiding her aside to wait where visitors without appointment were kept, a quiet corner where time stretched thin. Inside the palace walls, Rowan Blackthorne felt the shift almost immediately, a tightening that came with distance, subtle but undeniable, and he paused mid-conversation with an advisor, his focus slipping, his breathing losing its earlier ease, and though no one else noticed the change, he did, because he had learned the pattern well enough to recognize its absence. Elena waited. Hours passing marked by the movement of shadows across stone, her resolve tested not by fear, but by doubt seeded through indifference, because being ignored carried its own quiet weight, and more than once she considered turning back, knowing the rhythm would follow her if she did. But each time she imagined retreat, the strain sharpened, reinforcing that proximity mattered more than comfort. Word eventually reached a minor official who approached her with restrained impatience, questioning her purpose, her tone measured but firm as she reminded Elena of her place, suggesting rest, suggesting imagination, suggesting that concern without authority was not the same as responsibility. And Elena accepted the rebuke outwardly, lowering her gaze, even as she maintained her inner alignment, listening steadily, because she could feel the connection waver but not break. Rowan dismissed his advisor soon after, standing alone once more in a quiet hall, unsettled by the return of that hollow imbalance, and for the first time he asked a servant whether any unusual visitors had arrived that day, the question casual enough to pass as idle curiosity, yet charged with intent, and the answer, hesitant and vague, planted a thought he could not easily dismiss. Elena was escorted away from the inner gate by dusk, not expelled but redirected, told to return another day through proper channels. And as she stepped back into the cooling air, she felt the rhythm strain sharply, the response immediate and unmistakable, and she stopped, closing her eyes, grounding herself despite the public space, and breathed slowly until the connection steadied once more, though weaker than before. The guards noticed nothing beyond an omega pausing to collect herself, but inside the palace Rowan felt the echo of that pause, a brief alignment returning before slipping again, enough to confirm what he had begun to suspect, that something or someone nearby mattered. And as night settled and Elena turned away from the gates, her path uncertain but her resolve intact, both of them carried the same unspoken understanding, that barriers of rank and rule could delay recognition but not erase necessity, and that what had been dismissed as sensitivity would soon demand acknowledgement. The strain reached a turning point not with spectacle but with accumulation, because by the following night the rhythm Elena heart tracked no longer wavered gently with distance. It pulled tight and fast, compressing into shorter intervals that left little room to breathe, and she knew with quiet certainty that whatever balance had been holding was slipping. She remained near the palace outskirts rather than returning home, choosing a small and measured in narrow hallways and thin walls where the sounds of travelers faded into background noise. And there she listened, counting seconds, grounding herself again and again, aware that each moment mattered more than the last. Inside the palace, Rowan Blackthorne felt the change as a growing pressure that refused to be eased by focus or rest, not pain but urgency, as if his inner alignment demanded immediate attention. and when healers returned with familiar reassurances, he dismissed them sooner than protocol allowed. Standing alone in the wide chamber, where his breathing came shallow despite his efforts, recognizing at last that endurance was no longer enough. The echo of presence he had begun to notice days earlier flickered in and out, offering brief steadiness before fading. And the inconsistency unsettled him more than constant strain would have, because it suggested proximity mattered, and that whatever brought relief was near but obstructed. Elena felt that obstruction too, like a hand placed between two tuning forks, dulling the resonance without breaking it. And she realized the boundary was not distance alone but access, the walls and rules that kept her separated from the source. And the understanding sharpened her resolve even as fatigue weighed on her shoulders. When dawn came pale and cold, she approached the palace again, slower this time, conserving energy, and spoke to a different guard with the same calm explanation, her words steady despite the tremor in the rhythm beneath them. And though skepticism remained, the urgency in her presence drew attention she had not commanded before. Inside, Rowan made a decision he had resisted until now, summoning a trusted aide and asking directly whether anyone unusual had been turned away recently. The question simple but charged, and when the answer mentioned an Omega who spoke of listening rather than healing, something aligned in his mind with the echo he felt in his chest. Elena was kept waiting once more, time stretching thin as the rhythm tightened further, and she closed her eyes where she stood, breathing slowly, refusing to chase relief, offering steadiness instead, and the response came faint but grateful, enough to confirm she was still connected. Moments later, a quiet shift rippled through the space as a messenger approached, not with ceremony but with careful interest, asking her to repeat what she sensed, and Elena did so plainly, without embellishment, because this was not a plea for recognition but a statement of necessity. Rowan felt the alignment return more fully at that same moment, his breathing evening out as if guided, and he leaned forward, palms braced on stone, acknowledging at last that the relief was not imagined, that it responded to something real and present. The decision to allow the Omega closer did not come framed as mercy or exception, but as practicality, a response to an undeniable pattern. And as the order moved through the palace corridors, Elena felt the obstruction loosen, the rhythm steadying just enough to bring warmth back to her chest. When she was finally guided inside the outer hall, the air measured in cooler drafts and echoing steps. The connection strengthened immediately, not overwhelming but precise, and both of them, separated, still by doors and protocol, understood the same truth without words. That time was narrowing, and listening alone would soon require presence, and that survival now depended not on rank or command but on alignment found through trust. Elena Hart was guided through corridors measured in long, echoing strides, the air cooler and steadier the deeper she went, and with each step the rhythm she carried aligned more cleanly, as if the space itself were finally allowing it to pass without resistance. And she understood then that this was not about permission but proximity. When the doors opened into a quiet chamber where light filtered in from tall windows, she felt the connection settle into a calm, even cadence that steadied her breath before she saw him, and King Rowan Blackthorn, standing near a stone table worn smooth by years of use, felt the same settling without needing explanation, the pressure easing into balance as naturally as a breath released. They regarded one another without urgency, because urgency had already passed into necessity, and Elena did not bow or rush to speak. She grounded herself first, shoulders relaxed, feet planted, listening fully, while Rowan observed the way the room itself seemed to quiet around her, a detail that caught his attention more than any words could have. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm and clear, explaining not symptoms or solutions but alignment, describing the rhythm she heard and how it responded to nearness, how listening rather than forcing allowed balance to return, and Rowan listened with the focus he reserved for matters that determined outcomes, noting how his breathing matched her measured cadence as she spoke, how the hollow strain he had carried for days receded further with each moment of attention. He asked no questions meant to challenge her authority, only clarifying ones that sought understanding, and Elena answered simply, because complexity was unnecessary when the truth could be felt, and she demonstrated not with gesture but with presence, closing her eyes briefly to align fully, letting the rhythm pass through her awareness without resistance. And the effect was immediate and unmistakable, the room settling into a quiet that felt complete rather than empty. Rowan felt steadiness take hold in a way he had not experienced since the imbalance began, a grounded clarity that restored his posture and focus, and he recognized that what he had dismissed as sensitivity was in fact attunement, a skill refined through attention rather than dominance. He stepped closer, not invading space but narrowing distance enough to test what he already suspected, and Elena felt the alignment strengthen, not overwhelming but precise, confirming that proximity amplified balance without strain. The realization carried weight for both of them, because it meant that listening could not be relegated to distance or convenience. It required presence and trust, and Rowan acknowledged this without ceremony, instructing those present to allow the Omega to remain, his tone practical and composed, as if ordering supplies or schedules. Yet the significance was clear. Elena did not smile or react outwardly. She simply maintained alignment, understanding that this moment was not about recognition but function, about doing what was necessary to keep balance intact. As time passed, measured in quiet minutes rather than urgency, the steadiness held, and Rowan felt the return of something essential he had not known how to name, a sense of inner coherence that allowed thought and breath to move together again. When he finally spoke, it was to acknowledge necessity plainly, stating that her gift was required not as exception but as solution, and the words carried no sentiment, only certainty. Elena accepted this with the same calm resolve she had carried across miles and boundaries, knowing that the path ahead would demand continued presence and careful listening, but also knowing that the hardest part, being heard, had already been accomplished, and as the chamber settled into a shared quiet, both understood that survival had shifted from endurance to alignment, secured not by power alone, but by the courage to listen. The days that followed unfolded with a quiet gravity that reshaped how the palace breathed, because the steadiness Elena's heart brought did not flare and fade. It held, and those who moved through the halls began to notice changes they could not easily name. A calmer rhythm to conversations, fewer restless pauses, a sense that something essential had been set back into place. Rowan Blackthorne resumed his duties with a clarity that surprised even him, meetings measured in deliberate minutes, rather than strained endurance, decisions made without the background pressure he had learned to ignore, and each time Elena aligned herself nearby, the balance deepened, confirming that the connection was not temporary relief but a functional necessity. Curiosity followed certainty, and soon advisors and healers were invited to observe, not to judge but to understand, and Elena stood before them without performance or defense, explaining simply that she did not command the rhythm, she listened to it, that the land and its people carried patterns that could be sensed when one paid attention, and that alignment restored what force could not. Some frowned, some nodded, but when Rowan stepped closer and the steadiness intensified immediately, skepticism softened into recognition, because the effect was visible even to those who had doubted, his breathing evening, his posture grounding, the room settling as if a draft had been closed. Word traveled quickly in careful tones, not as rumor, but as acknowledgement, and the narrative shifted from concern about an ailing king to respect for a skill long overlooked, and Elena felt the weight of that shift not as pride, but as responsibility, because recognition brought expectation, and expectation required consistency. Rowan addressed his council plainly, stating that the Omega's presence was required for the stability of his leadership and the well-being of the realm, his language practical and measured, leaving no space for dismissal. And in doing so he reframed the hierarchy without overturning it, asserting that strength took many forms and that listening was among them. Elena observed the reactions quietly, noting how some recalibrated quickly while others needed time, and she maintained her alignment throughout, offering steadiness rather than argument. Because proof lay not in persuasion but in outcome, the healers adjusted their roles accordingly, focusing on support rather than solution. And in that cooperation Elena found a rhythm that did not drain her, because she was no longer resisting disbelief, she was simply present, listening and responding as needed. Rowan met her gaze later in a quieter space, acknowledging the change with directness, stating that what she provided was not a favor but a requirement, and Elena accepted the words. With calm resolve, understanding that necessity brought protection as well as scrutiny, when he announced publicly that no one was to interfere with her work or question her access. The declaration carried weight, without spectacle, and those who heard it understood that boundaries had been redrawn by function rather than decree. Elena felt the connection settle into a sustainable cadence, not urgent now, but vigilant, a shared awareness that required maintenance, and she recognized that her path forward would be shaped by this role, not as elevation but as integration, her listening woven into the daily life of the palace. As evening light measured in long shadows crossed the stone floors, Rowan stood beside her without ceremony, the steadiness holding between them, and both understood that survival had given way to continuity, secured by recognition earned through presence, and that what had once been dismissed as sensitivity had become a cornerstone of balance for a king and his realm. The balance held not because it was guarded, but because it was understood, and in the days that followed, Elena Hart learned how stability felt when it no longer demanded constant vigilance, a steady hum beneath her awareness that allowed her to breathe without counting seconds. She moved through the palace with quiet purpose, not watched as an anomaly, but acknowledged as a function, and that shift carried more weight than ceremony ever could, because it meant her listening had become woven into the rhythm of daily life rather than summoned only in crisis. Rowan Blackthorne addressed the realm from the great hall measured in long strides and familiar echoes, his voice calm, and even as he spoke of continuity and preparedness, and those gathered noticed the absence of strain that had once shadowed his presence, a clarity that did not command attention but earned it, and when he paused and gestured for Elena to stand beside him, the room settled into attentive stillness. He did not elevate her with titles or grand declarations. He stated simply that her gift was essential to the stability of the crown, that no one was to interfere with her work or question her access, and that listening, when it preserved balance, was a strength the realm would honor, words delivered without flourish yet received with unmistakable gravity. Elena felt the weight of every gaze without flinching, grounding herself as she always had, letting the steady rhythm pass through her awareness. And in that moment, she understood that recognition did not change who she was. It clarified what she had always done, and clarity brought its own quiet authority. The council adjusted its practices, consultations scheduled with consideration for alignment rather than convenience, and healers learned to read her cues, collaborating rather than correcting. And through that cooperation, the palace found a new cadence, one that did not exhaust itself chasing force when balance sufficed. Rowan met Elena later in a quieter space where the evening light measured time in long shadows across stone, acknowledging that survival had demanded humility from him, the willingness to accept support that did not look like power, and Elena responded with equal honesty, explaining that listening required trust on both sides, that alignment could not be imposed, only invited. The connection between them settled into a sustainable rhythm, not constant proximity, but consistent access, a shared understanding that allowed distance without dissonance. And both recognized that this balance would endure only as long as it was respected. As news traveled outward, the narrative changed beyond the palace walls, from whispered concern to steady confidence. And those who had once dismissed sensitivity began to reconsider what strength meant when measured by outcome rather than display. Elena returned at times to the edge of the settlement she had once called home, standing beneath the open sky, listening as she always had, and she felt the land respond with a quiet steadiness that mirrored the palace within her awareness, confirmation that balance extended beyond walls and rank. Rowan continued his rule with a grounded clarity that allowed him to listen not only to counsels, but to the realm itself, understanding now that leadership was not diminished by acknowledging what it needed. The final understanding between them required no vow or spectacle, only consistency, and as the nights grew calmer and the rhythm held true, it became clear to all who paid attention that survival had given way to continuity, secured by the courage to listen, and that the Omega once overlooked now stood as a living reminder that true strength was gentle, enduring, and capable of holding a kingdom together simply by hearing what others could not.